Hello everyone, what's up? Today I have a special treat for you, an interview with renowned sci-fi author Adrian Tchaikovsky. This interview was recorded at the Celsius 232 Festival in Avilés, Spain, where Adrian and I discussed his remarkable career in science fiction, his contributions to the Warhammer 40k universe, and of course his first Black Library novel, Day of Ascension. Join us as we dive into his experience writing a Genestealer Cults novel, his collaboration with Games Workshop, and his approach to crafting epic sci-fi worlds in award-winning series like Children of Time. So, whether you're a Warhammer fan or just love great science fiction, this conversation is packed with insights you will not want to miss. So, hello there, Adrian.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to have the chance to interview you after meeting you at your presentation the other day and also having a beer with you at the Celsius. It's our privilege to be able to do this.
Oh, that's very kind, thank you.
We had some questions in mind, both about your involvement with Games Workshop and the world of Warhammer, but also about science fiction in general, and of course your own writings. Mm-hmm. So without further ado, I wanted to ask you what initially drew you to science fiction in particular?
I've always been a science fiction reader since I was very, very small. I grew up reading Doctor Who novels and things like that, so I don't think I've ever really considered anything different to that. But I mean, both as a reader and as a writer, I've always felt science fiction and fantasy can do everything that any other genre can do. You can have mysteries, you can have romance, you can have all manner of sort of character development and big sort of human themes, mm-hmm. and you can have dragons and spaceships. So yeah, why would you not? Why would you write in any other genre?
Right. Big box of toys, I guess, or sandbox. Could you tell us how your interest in the, I would think, rather peculiar Warhammer universe, how it began?
Well, I used to play. What, 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle,
really?
way back in the 80s, and I used to play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay when that was a thing, and so I was always kind of aware of the universe, and I would pick up the books and I'd collect some of the figures, and then later on, after quite a long gap of not really having much to do with it, I hit a board games expo in the United Kingdom, where they were just releasing the Genestealer Cults material. And they had the big posters with the art. And normally, Games Workshop art is very strongly coded as to who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Mm-hmm. But in those early Genestealer Cults pictures, it is absolutely coded that the Genestealer Cults are the heroes, and they are valiantly fighting off sort of hordes of, I think it was Adeptus Mechanicus in the original. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, well,
the oppressors, maybe.
Yeah, and I just thought, well, I know they're not actually the good guys, but I really want to write that story where they basically get the hero treatment. And so that kind of got me back in. Also, at about that time, that was very shortly before lockdown, and one of the things that kept me sane in lockdown was I got a whole bunch of miniatures which I just built and painted.
Oh, really?
Yes. And that's still something I do, and it's a very useful de-stressing activity for me, just to
kind of like Grimoire.
And so I'm not quite sure whether they've had more money out of me or I've had more money out of them. But yes, so I got hold of, because I know in the British writing community is fairly small, so I knew a fair number of people who could make an introduction for me to the editors at Black Library. And I said, look, I'd really like to write about this faction. They didn't have anyone else writing about the Genestealer Cults, really. And so that just turned out to work very well. I did them a short story, which I think came out with Raised in Darkness was the title.
Right.
And then based on that, we kind of expanded that into the novella
Ascension Day?
Ascension Day, and now they've asked me to write Age of Sigmar material, because I think they're looking to expand the range for that.
Age of Sigmar, not fantasy?
Well, Age of Sigmar it is. It's
Because the old world is sort of coming back.
yes, yes, and I know. I mean, I know there are a lot of big fans of the old world who are not so keen on Age of Sigmar. For me, though, fantasy fiction is certainly going through a phase of quite low magic, the gritty, grim, darky sort of thing, which means that you don't get that many completely wild, out there, high magic books. So Age of Sigmar is a phenomenal opportunity to just go really quite mad.
Right.
Also, there are a lot of quite odd factions in Age of Sigmar, which are not the standard fantasy.
A bit more
fare
unique,
at all.
perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you've got things like the Sylvaneth and the Seraphon and so forth, and that's so much story potential that hasn't really been tapped yet.
True, can definitely see that. Thank you. Could you tell me a bit more about your own painting? I'm very curious about that.
Oh well, I mean,
What
yes,
do you like to paint?
I like the more dynamically posed figures. So I found my absolute favourites have generally been things like the Kill Team and the Warcry set. So you've got quite a small set of just very, very sort of in the middle of action sort of
dynamic poses, and unique miniatures, not like repeated, the same guy repeated over and over. Very nice. Do you have any particular preference as to factions or anything like that, or color schemes maybe?
I do have a big old Seraphon set, and I particularly like the especially the Arachnarok spiders, because obviously spiders is a bit of a thing with me. So I've got a couple of those, a couple of variants of those painted up.
Beautiful. I'd love to see some pictures of that. I'm sure our audience would like to see them as well. Adrian, could you tell me a bit more about Day of Ascension? How was your creative process behind that?
So, I think that aside from the Tyranids themselves, the Genestealer Cults are the hardest of the 40k factions to really get hero potential out of.
Right.
Just because of this very peculiar idea that even though they can be very earnest in what they're doing, they're all, at the end of the day, they are usually depicted as being tragically betrayed and deceived at the end of it. And so I wanted to see can I put a different spin on that? And hopefully I have with the books, because the other thing, it's one of those 40k truisms, there are no good guys. And that certainly applies to the Imperium. And I think, well, at the end of the day, being worked to death or used as spare parts by the Adeptus Mechanicus on a mining world is not actually worse or even particularly different to being devoured by a Tyranid hive fleet and used for biomass. It's basically entirely equivalent. And if you have that belief system where that's actually what you want to become part of the angelic host, which you will literally become part of the angelic host, not maybe quite in the way that the teachings say, then I quite like having that end set up with the hive fleet descending and everything about to be eaten, and that's a good thing as far as the cultists are concerned. So rather than having that moment of sort of betrayal and shock and, oh no, we were wrong all along, so yes, they're with it right to the end.
Right. A wonderful opportunity to contribute, I guess.
Well, the thing is, I mean, the 40k universe, with the possible exception of, I don't know, maybe the Tau, is basically just a series of meat grinders. So, pick your meat grinder.
How was your experience writing for Games Workshop in terms of creative freedom, lack thereof, or maybe more like a balance between expressing yourself and doing the things that you wanted and respecting the lore?
So this was very interesting. I had never written for, we call it IP writing, so intellectual property writing. I'd never written for an IP before.
Right.
And so it was a bit of a rude shock with the first short story. I got a lot of editing notes basically saying, well, that's not how it works in this universe. My favourite one of which was, I had described an agriculture world as sort of these rolling golden fields of corn. I was told, no, there are no nice planets in this universe. Right. Everything is horrible. And I did better with the novella because I kind of got the hang of it by then. And also, I found out the staff of my local Games Workshop shop were invaluable. I could always go there and just ask them lore questions, and they were generally
really.
Because one of the things you find that sometimes the lore kind of falls out of the bottom of the books as editions advance. So, for example, I wrote a story called The Long and Hungry Road about a Tyranid hive fleet later on. How do Tyranids move from star to star? It's not in the current book. It has been covered previously, and thankfully the people at the shop remember, oh yes, this is how it worked 2 editions back, and it hasn't been updated. It's just not specifically set out in the current codex. So after a while, you know what to look out for and where you need to expand your own knowledge. But the other thing is, unlike a lot of IP properties, Warhammer is not enormously dependent on specific people. So yes, you have the Emperor, you have the Primarchs, but as soon as you start moving away from that territory, you wouldn't necessarily expect to encounter like a named Imperial Guard officer or anything like that, unlike, for example, encountering Darth Vader in Star Wars or something like that. So there is a huge amount more creative freedom in the universe as long as you can find a corner of it that no one has been playing in.
Right.
And
your own sandbox.
Yeah, and it's an enormous universe, and there's a huge amount of variation which is just built in. And the other thing is, unlike, say, Star Wars or Star Trek or a lot of those other settings, there's a whole part of the game which is encouraging people to play all of these other factions. So, there are a lot of Orc players, there are Eldar players. It's not the case that everyone is playing the good guy as you might with a particular computer game property or something like that. And so the demand for and the scope for stories told from all of these different points of view is, I think, bigger in that kind of game setting than in pretty
inherently,
much any others.
perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is definitely something that Black Library are pushing at the moment, because we've seen like Mike Brooks write. I think he's got a Drakari novel coming out, and he's written Orc novels, and Nate Crowley has written Necron novels. So the idea of getting those extra perspectives in to give effectively extra lore support to the players of those factions is a really good idea.
Very interesting. Adrian, the other day at your presentation, which my friend Lucas, say hello, Lucas.
Hi guys.
And I attended. One of the things that really struck a chord with me was this phrase of yours that all science fiction basically is about meeting the alien. And I thought, well, if you apply that to the 40K universe, that's quite an interesting premise. Could you elaborate a bit on this perspective of yours?
I think there are just to clarify, I think there are other things that science fiction can do, but certainly the science fiction that fascinates me most is where you get that human-alien boundary, which that plays very obviously into the Genestealer Cults. But although there is obviously a standard mode for different species to interrelate in 40K, which is to say shooting each other, I think there's a lot of really interesting stories to be told about just how those philosophies encounter one another in a not immediately sort of apocalyptic sense. And while some of the factions and some of the ideologies, like you're not ever going to have a Deathcore of Creed novel about drinking tea and diplomacy, for example. But there's certainly a lot of scope, I think, just to explore all of these very fascinating, very different aliens, and at least give them a bit of scope to find out how they do bounce off human attitudes before the guns come out. Because it's 40K, the guns are going to come out at some point. But I mean, for example, I would love to have a go at the Leagues of Votann, especially because they have this peculiar relationship with the Imperium, where they are Xenos, but they're not actively at war. And at the same time, they've got this whole thing of they're ruled by thinking machines, which, if that became known, would be another crusade in the brewing. And so there is so much potential there, in not just the combat, but in the details.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah, it is a phenomenally rich setting, and because the Space Marines tend to get the limelight, there's a lot of stuff there that hasn't really been explored yet.
Adrian, ultimately, our viewers are all basically science fiction fans in general, not only Warhammer fans. And we know that you're a hugely successful and prolific writer, and that your works outside of the small world of Warhammer, have garnered a lot of critical acclaim. Well, it's just a fact, basically. How would you describe your approach toward world building, in particular, in, for example, Children of Time?
So, I mean, Children of Time is a slightly unusual setup, because the Children of Time is a thought experiment, and it's specifically a thought experiment of what if this species of spider became was given the room to become a dominant sentient species on a planet. And the whole book is kind of built around giving that thought experiment the chance to write. And the way I build it up there and the way I tend to approach world building is you take your core idea like that and you drop it into a pond and you watch where all the ripples go. And it's finding out all of these sort of the consequences of that initial decision and what changes and then what changes because of that builds up the world. And with Children of Time, you get to see it building up because you see the world develop over hundreds of years, generation to generation, as their civilization is being built up. But even if I'm not writing in that kind of long-term span, that's the process I go through at the beginning before I put pen to paper. And in general, world building is kind of the heart of how I approach writing. So I always have the world, and it's generally that I would like to tell stories about this world. And I'll sit down and I'll work out the details of the world, and that will suggest the story that is most interesting, that will showcase the world, and the characters that are going to give me the best opportunity to explore it.
Right. So you do basically all of that field work, if you like, beforehand?
Yes. Wow. I need to feel I've got a very solid ground underneath me, a world or a universe or whatever, whatsoever sort of scale I'm writing in. And then when I've got that, it's really the gift that keeps on giving. Because it means all the details I'm thinking up are coming from this same place. So everything kind of fits together, and it means I don't have a very heavy second pass with a lot of books because everything already kind of lines up.
I was just thinking, do you have as many novels or series of novels as you have worlds that you have built this way? Or have you got perhaps a sort of repository of worlds that you would like at some point?
I mean, I've got,
if that makes sense.
I've got a backlog of places I want to write about. Basically, I have a whole sort of file of ideas. I mean, I'm currently, with the work I've got books that will take me to about 2030. But I've got at least a dozen full-on ideas after that I want to explore at some time. I've got, especially because most of the work I do is science fiction. I tend to have quite a few fantasy ideas kicking about, sort of, and developing them. I've just got to the point where I think I'm probably going to make one of them the setting for a role-playing campaign. And just actually play some games in it and just flesh it out.
You've preempted my next question. Okay, sorry.
My first fantasy series my first books in print were a fantasy series called Shadows of the Apt. It's a great big epic fantasy with, there are people, they've all got sort of weird insect powers, there's steampunk technology, there's sort of old magic, all of that stuff. And that was a role-playing game campaign when I was in university in the 90s that I resurrected to write some books about, because it had been a world I'd created that I knew extremely well. And since then, I have not done that full-on, play the campaign and then write the book, and I'm kind of ready to do it again.
Nice. We'd love to see that happen. We're also all into RPGs. Do you play RPGs yourself?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm playing in 2 campaigns at the moment. I've just finished running a Warhammer Fantasy role-play campaign.
Oh wow!
Which
what rule set?
The 4th edition, the Cubicle 7 one. We finished off by teleporting the entire party to Lustria.
I see.
So that there may well be a second go. They've just produced the Lustria source book, so I thought I'm going to get them over there, and then if I want to run that, I've got them there.
Nice. Thank you. Since you've mentioned projects that you're sort of sitting on at the moment or contemplating, could you tell us about any current projects or upcoming books or anything that readers or viewers might be excited about?
Yes, absolutely. So, I've had quite a lot out this year. So we've just last month, I've had Service Model, which is my book about robots and the end of the world.
Very apt.
I've got coming out at the end of this year, I've got coming out in October, the Shoulders of Giants, Age of Sigmar novella. And at the end of the year is book 3 of my fantasy series, which will be Days of Shattered Faith, which I should say, in case anyone's feeling like trying it, that series is written so each book can be picked up on its own. You don't have to have read the others.
Wow.
So there are kind of threads and Easter eggs if you do read them in order, but it's not mandatory.
Nice.
moving forward from that, I have possibly the weirdest science fiction book I've written coming out in 2025 called Shroud, which is, it's about an inordinately hostile planet. So very, very high pressure, zero oxygen, it's got a very dense atmosphere, so there's no light down there, but it's also got a thriving ecosystem, and everything on the ecosystem generates radio waves to sense and to communicate, which means the whole planet just screams.
Wow.
And then two people get stuck on the planet in a deteriorating vehicle and no way of calling the ship because of all the noise of the planet, and they have to get to all the way across the world to the one point where they can signal that they are in fact still alive.
That sounds fascinating.
It was a lot of fun, especially the other thing is there is a species on the planet, which is sentient and becomes aware of them as they journey and starts to interact with them in various ways.
Can you write an RPG about that, please?
a bit of a one-shot. And then I'm currently, as at this moment, writing the fourth book in the children's series, which will be Children of Strife, which will probably be 2026. Assume I can get it done.
I can see that you definitely plan ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, I am lucky enough to be able to write fairly quickly, and also I've got a number of publishers who are putting the stuff out. So at that point, you kind of got to juggle your time very carefully.
Interesting. What advice would you give to aspiring sci-fi or fantasy writers these days?
The first thing I would say is that it took me 15 years to get into print. Now, it doesn't have to take that long. I was very bad at taking any kind of constructive criticism, and being able to get someone to read your work and give you pointers and not be terribly defensive about it is an art form that I didn't have at the time, but it's very useful if you can do it. But also, there is a huge amount of luck. All I would say is, if you keep submitting, then ideally at some point your manuscript will end up in front of the right editor at the right time when they're looking for that kind of book and they've had a good lunch and are feeling generally well disposed towards the universe. And at that point, you need that manuscript to be as good as it possibly can be. Which is another thing, I was not very good at self-editing, so getting any kind of assistance with that is really useful. Make it as easy on the editor as possible, make sure what you're sending them has a good synopsis and a good cover letter, and make sure that the chapters they are presented with give them a really good feel for what the book is. The other thing, I guess, is a lot of people think, well, Warwick, what is the popular thing at the moment? I will write that kind of book. I'm sure this has worked for some people. I feel there are strong reasons not to do that. Firstly, by the time you submit the book and by the time they read it, that's probably not popular anymore. Secondly, that's also the thing that everyone else is submitting for that exact reason. Anyone can write that kind of book and the editors will be deluged by it. But if you write a book that is specifically your book, only one person can write that.
Right.
And also, you're going to be in a much better position to write another one if they like it. Because one of the things a lot of people find is you can spend 5 years writing a book and then they want the sequel within 6 months. I mean, weirdly, I don't necessarily recommend this, but when I submitted the first of the Shadows of the Apt series, I had written the first 4 books.
Wow.
Because I knew that if I wrote the first one and it got rejected, I wouldn't go on, and I wanted to write that first plot arc. That turned out to be really, really handy because they could release them very quickly. Sort of one every couple of months, which built the readership. And I think it's something that publishers like to do, but very few writers are in a position to have the books ready.
Wow, I can only begin to imagine what that must have been like. How did you maintain motivation, not knowing definitely?
Because 15 years, and that's 15 books. So I would write a book, it would get rejected. I would write a different book. I wouldn't go back to the same book or anything like that. I was getting to the point, I was getting towards about age 35. And I basically said, right, this isn't working. It's having, frankly, a genuinely negative effect on my mental health because you can only go so far just hoping and hoping and hoping.
Right.
I will wait till I'm, if I don't get anywhere by the time I'm 35, I will give up. And in order to have the best final shot at things, I said, right, I will find a setting that I'm very familiar with. So again, I found the one that I've been running the games in, so I knew all about this. I'm very comfortable with it. I could write 4 books, and in fact I wrote 10 in the end.
Wow.
And then I submitted it, and as it happened, an agent got back to me and said, yes, let's talk, about a week before my 35th birthday. So it just worked out. But it's genuinely very hard. It's a business where you don't tend to have much of a support network. I strongly recommend, if you can, get into a writers group. Get into a circle of other writers, have other people who know what it's like to be able to talk to. And that can help a great deal. I mean, I am currently in a sort of a Zoom group of writers. We meet every Friday. That's really useful, just to have someone to complain to, who understands what it's like. And it's the same, it's the same with unpublished writers. But if you can get that kind of community just to kind of cushion the blows, that's really good.
To use an RPG analogy, that sounds to me a bit like a guild.
Yeah.
Very useful. Adrian, in closing, I would like to ask you about your legacy. What do you see as your legacy? Looking back, you have a hugely successful career. What would you identify as, I don't know, favorite time, favorite book?
Oh, well, I hope there are more books to come. At the moment, the fantasy series I'm currently on is definitely the most fun I've ever had writing anything. Mostly, I've got a bit of a different process with this. Rather than planning everything out chapter by chapter by chapter, I start with the world, and then I'm just sort of following the characters around. I follow a character, and then someone else crosses their path, and I'll follow them for a bit, and you get this mosaic of quite ordinary lives in the shadow of these very big, sort of high magical fantasy events. And that's proved a lot of fun to do, and it's given me quite a different feel of book out of it. As far as legacy, so I wrote a book about spiders, and I seem to have been successful in getting a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise much like spiders to be at least reasonably sympathetic to the spiders. And in doing so, I probably saved the lives of a lot of real spiders who've just been gently ushered out rather than hit with a newspaper or something like that. So let that be my legacy.
Okay, perhaps one last question. You've been extremely kind to Lucas and myself. Again, thank you. I know that one of the things that comes with success like yours is that you must have legions of sometimes rabid fans. How have your experiences in dealing with those legions of fans, how have they been so far? Mostly positive, I hope. Do you have any anecdotes you'd like to share?
I don't think I've quite hit that point. I am a long way off rock star status. I think writers have a bit of an advantage in that we're not necessarily innately recognisable because unless your photo is on the book, people aren't going to know what you look like. So far, 99% of my interactions with fans online and in person have been entirely positive. Honestly, here at Celsius, which is one of my favourite festivals to go to, there's always a wonderful crowd. Everyone is always extremely pleasant and friendly and welcoming. And I think I probably signed more books here for my signing slot than I ever signed in London before. You get the occasional, usually kind of anonymous contact, through the website or something like that. But I'm well aware that there are authors out there, especially unfortunately female authors out there, who get an awful lot worse all the time. So I figure I can live with it in that case.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for us to have you here today. Thank you.
Cheers.
So guys, I hope that you enjoyed today's video. A big thank you to my Patreon supporters. Your support means everything to me, and it really keeps the channel going. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, keep it up and weather it out.